Um, so let's say this. I don't know that we can do just like a day dedicated to vocabulary in general, but if I ever say a word that you're like, Mr. Kenny, what in the world are you saying? Let me know, and I'll explain it, clarify it, stuff like that. But I will always be very intentional about covering all the vocabulary for the course, right? And so, but yeah, just ask anytime there's a word that you're like, hey, what are you talking about? What in the world does blank mean? I'm always more than happy to talk through those things more often. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so really quick, I'm going to cover, Caleb, your question about more examples of a convenient sample, right? Remember, a convenient sample is anything that's just easy, right? In general, if it's convenient, it's easy, it's biased. And so we have these examples right here where we did the first 5 words in the song. But let's just say in general, let's say I want to know, let's see, we're going to use this later. So I might as well pull it out. So this thing is called box balling. Box balling is like a little game that you can do. You can even get like an app for it. For the most part, people kind of compete to see who can do more hits without messing up. And so you wrap this around here, make sure this goes somewhere around your belly button. That's a little long, because I don't know if y'all know this, but I'm short, I'm aware. There we go. Alright, so you take this and you punch it. Wow, that was terrible. I'm usually better. We'll see how the rest of this goes. Right? So boop, 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 boop. And we're going to talk more about this later. That was even bad compared to the first. But we count how many times I hit the ball, right? Now, let's say I want to know what is a typical number of times that students at Hillcrest High School can hit that ball without messing up, right? If I just take the students from this class, that's really convenient, isn't it? Do you think the students from this class, though, are necessarily representative of the whole school? So if it's easy, it's convenience. Does that make sense? So anything that's easy. Let's say I want to know about, and there's other ways that it can be biased as well, but let's say I just want to know, hey, how do people going to the next basketball game at Hillcrest feel about the gym? Like, do we need a new basketball gym or not, right? So first off, if I just take the first 50 people that show up, that's easy, isn't it? But are they necessarily representative of the rest of like Hillcrest students or Hillcrest fans? No. Okay, so one, that's convenient. Definitely not representative, so biased. But two, how do you think that group of people would be different than the rest of Hillcrest students or Hillcrest basketball fans? Why would they be different than the rest of the fans? The first 50 to show up. Let me ask you this. If you're a die-hard Hillcrest High School basketball fan, when are you going to get to the gym? You're going to be one of the first ones there, right? So who's the first 50 going to be? People that are die-hard fans, they probably want a new gym, right? Okay. So that first 50 is definitely not representative of the rest. And that's not the only way. But in general, if it's easy to get, it's out. If it's not random, in general, we want to throw that sample out. Does that help clarify convenience? Okay, so glad we have that on there. By the way, I do want to point this out. I put this on the weekly reflection, right? But I don't remember if I put it up here on today. But in general, when it comes to bell ringers, yeah, generally, and I didn't put it up here because I put it on here, but in general on bell ringers, one thing, even if I don't write up here, that you can always do is you can write any question you have on a vertical surface, and I'll answer those questions before we start class, right? So I specifically had questions on here, but in general, you can always write a question on any vertical surface so that it can be, I can easily tell it's from you or not, whatever you want, okay? Okay, so statistical and non-statistical. Let's address that first before we get to too much else. And then Jeremiah, you want bias and undercoverage. That's a huge part of today, so I'm going to hold off until we get to later into the lesson. Sound good? Okay, so yeah, let's look at this. Statistical versus non-statistical. So let's say, I'm going to try to remember the examples I came up with earlier because they were pretty decent. Yeah, I got nothing. Alright, I'm going to make new ones up. I'm going to try to... Ooh, here's a decent one.
What? Oh, I remember them.
How many Americans think environmental issues are a major problem? Okay? So how many how many Americans think environmental issues are a major problem? Specifically in the US, right? Things that we need to address. Alright, so there's one question. Let's go with, yeah, I remember the bus one. I just don't love that one. I'm going to come up with something different. Oh, here we go. How many administrators does Hillcrest High School have? And then, what is a typical amount of times a person can hit the ball in box balling? Specifically without messing up, right? Alright, we got 3 questions here. So, Caleb, this top one up here. First off, do you think it's statistical or not? Okay, so you got a claim, right? Have you given me evidence for that claim yet? So one thing I want to pause on, I just want to point out, this entire year, one of the things I'm always going to focus on is being able to make an argument. Meaning, you make a claim, and then you provide evidence for that claim. That's a skill that's always useful, and it helps me assess how deep your understanding is. Because guess what? If you got a deep understanding, you're not going to forget it. If you guess, or if you just have memorized a few words, you'll short term probably be okay, but long term you might not. And I want to make sure that we have deep understanding. So your claim, right, is that this is a statistical question. What's your evidence? So statistical question. Why do you say that?
No, it's not. Everybody would think that environmental issues are a major problem.
Okay, so not everyone's going to think that environmental issues are a major problem. Okay, can someone add on to that idea or push back on it?
It can change over time.
So that, not wrong. You're just adding a detail we don't need. Do you know what detail you're adding that we don't need? The overtime, right? Like, it doesn't have to be overtime. Like, if I ask everybody today, are those responses going to be the same for everybody?
No.
Nope. So these responses have, there's a keyword that I always want. So you hinted at it, strong evidence, even stronger evidence, but there's a key term I want us to always hit with this. Responses have a potential for variability. Because it's quite possible that everyone thinks environmental issues are a major problem. I know I do. My undergraduate degree is actually in civil engineering, and I actually focused on environmental engineering. So we studied water, wastewater treatment, air pollution, things like that. And so I became very well acquainted with environmental issues and why we have certain laws that we do. But not everyone knows about all the issues we have. So, statistical question, responses have a potential for, that shouldn't say variable, should say variability. Okay? Alright, Amy, what do you think about how many administrators does Hillcrest High School have? Is that a statistical question?
You said what?
Yeah, is how many administrators Hillcrest High School have, is that a statistical question? Okay, so y'all help her out. Let's start here. Y'all help her out. What does it mean to have a statistical question?
You can change.
What can change?
Yeah, the chances that, it can be different decisions.
Okay, so coming back up here, change, right? So the responses have a potential for variability. Like, please notice, like, this is the defining characteristic of a statistical question. Right, that's the defining characteristic of a statistical question. Remember, by the way, like, you don't have to use it, but I highly recommend it. You remember how I gave you all those FAIR models? That the whole point of that is you can have a succinct set of notes right there. You don't have to search for it. There's your notes and there's your check your understanding questions with it. But responses have a potential for variability. That's statistical. So, does this have a potential for variability? Why do you say no?
Because, you're counting the one that's currently there.
We just count the ones that are currently there. How many administrators do we have? Do y'all know?
About what, 20?
20? Dog. We got, who's our principal?
No, 15.
Mr. Hinton, right?
Somebody.
Okay, do y'all know what I mean by administrators, I guess?
Oh,
Like principal, assistant principal, and count.
oh,
It's just principals and assistant principals. That's it.
oh, like what, 3, 4?
Like 3, 4.
I think it's 5. Let's count them. We got Mr. Hinton. He's our principal, right? Mr. Thomas over in the CTE wing. Miss Embry, Miss Smith, and Mr. Armstrong. So we got 5. Is that ever going to change?
It could.
I mean, it will. Well, maybe eventually. But, like, is that a fact, or do I need to collect data for that? That's a fact. Like, that is what it is. There is no potential for variability. Like, today, tomorrow, the next day, unless someone dies, let's hope that doesn't happen, right? We got 5 administrators.
So when they be,
Huh?
when they be replaced?
And so eventually they would be replaced as well. We're supposed to have 5 administrators, right? So, this is
Non-statistical.
non-statistical. I'm not going to write it up here, but it goes back to the same reason. What's my evidence? Instead of responses have a potential for variability, now responses don't have a potential for variability. There are 5 administrators. Point blank period. Now, you can always change that to make it statistical in the sense like, hey, how many administrators are at Hillcrest High School each day on average? Well, is every administrator here every single day?
No.
No. So like that would make it statistical. But how many do we have? 5. That's it. Okay. So Mariah, what is a typical amount of times a person can hit the ball in box balling? Statistical or non-statistical? Why non-statistical? Well, what makes something statistical?
It's a fact.
So, well, statistical versus non-statistical is all about what? You said it? Potential for variability. If it has potential for variability, it is statistical. If there is no potential for variability, it's non-statistical. So let me ask you this. Do you think you're going to hit the ball the same number of times that I'm going to hit the ball? Or that Mimi's going to hit the ball? Or that Jeremiah's going to hit the ball? So what's there potential for? Well, potential for variability, so the question is, right. The question is, or what you always need to ask yourself is, will different people have different responses? If people have different responses, it's statistical as can be. Right? So there's a chance for variability in responses. And notice it doesn't have to say, use the same exact word every single time. Notice I didn't use the same exact language, but do these have the same ideas? Thank you. These defining characteristics. Am I saying the same thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Responses have a chance for variability. That's That's it. As long as you got that, you're good. Now I do want to make sure I feel like I do y'all a disservice if I didn't recap categorical and quantitative just a little bit. And I'll go ahead and tell you. You need to pay attention to the wording on these things. How many Americans think environmental issues are a major problem? Do you think that's categorical or quantitative?
Quantitative,
Why do you think quantitative?
because you have to count the amount of people that think that.
So you gotta count how many people think that environmental issues are a problem, right? Okay. Let me say this though. Do you think environmental issues are a problem?
No.
No. Tracy, what about you? Do you think environmental issues are a major problem? No. Caleb? You think they are? Okay. Mariah, do you think environmental issues are a major problem? No. So 3-1. Mimi? Yes. 3-2. Ms. Kowalski?
Yeah.
3 to 3.
What you mean, like?
So air quality, like in Birmingham, there are days where if you walk outside, or there's warnings to not walk outside because there's too many air particles that are unhealthy for your lungs, pollution in rivers. Y'all are probably a little too young to have paid attention to it, but in Flint, Michigan, like 2012, 2013, I think, they had major issues to the point where they couldn't even drink the water that was there. So stuff like that, but air pollution in general, water pollution. And regardless though, I want y'all to hear me on this. What was your response? Was your response a quantity or was your response a category?
Okay.
Because it says how many, you're gonna have to count. But your responses were a category, so the data is categorical. I was intentional to make us think about this. Notice we have to go back to what type of response do we have. So the response is yes or no. So categorical data. Okay. So don't forget, this is why I did this way. Jeremiah, every set of statistics will deal with numbers, right? I'll have to count. Do you like basketball? The answer is yes or no, right? I'll count that. But the question is, was the response, it's all about the responses, was the response a quantity or a category? Does that make sense? So, how many administrators does Hillcrest High School have? 5, so that response is a
Hold on.
quantitative, remember we're focused on data right now, right?
Yeah.
So the data is quantitative, right? The response was a quantity, quantitative data. Right here, what, that might initially make me think categorical, but let's read the rest of it. What is a typical amount of times a person can hit the ball in box volley? It's going to be quantitative. Let's say I hit the ball 9 times. I counted that response of 9, didn't I? So the response here, the response is a quantity. So quantitative data.
So it depends on how you answer it.
Correct. It's all about the response, both for statistical, non-statistical, categorical, quantitative. It's all about the responses. If it's statistical, the responses have potential for variability. If it's non-statistical, the responses don't have a potential for variability. If the data is categorical, the response is a category. If it's quantitative, the response is a quantity. It's all about the responses, which is what we talked about the other day. I know it takes time for these things to sink in, but it's all about the response. So you have to understand and look for, okay, what kind of response am I going to get? Does that help that sink in a little bit better? Good with that? Okay. Okay. Mariah, you good with that now? We're better with it? So please make sure that you study this vocabulary. Please make sure you know that detail backwards and forwards, because that's how you're going to be more successful. You've got to know vocabulary. I think that that's one of those things that's heavily undervalued in education, is we don't think through, okay, so what vocabulary do we have to know to be successful, or what does this vocabulary mean? Because there's the concept of categorical data, it's in the name. The data fits into a what? Category. Quantitative data, the data is a quantity. That's it. If you know the vocabulary, it helps you get there more successfully. But we gotta know these things backwards and forwards. Okay, so remember the whole idea though of statistics is, yeah, we have statistical questions, we wanna answer those questions, but like in this case, Vold's bullet hole problem, we had these airplanes coming back from battle, and they were all shot up, and we wanted to find out, okay, where should we put the armor, right? Now, did I have all of the airplanes that got shot up?
No.
No, because some of them were shot up and shot down, right? And so, we had to take this small group, what are we calling this small group here? A sample, this subset, a sample, to make an inference, a prediction about the population of all the airplanes, right? So remember, that's the whole thing with statistics. I usually can't do a census. I can't usually collect data from the entire population for one reason or another. So I want to take a sample, I want to take that small group and make a prediction. Remember with This Is America, I didn't want to look at all 610 words. That would have taken way too long, right? So I took a sample of 5 and made a prediction off of that sample of 5. But if we've got bad data, if our data is biased, it's not an accurate representation. We thought maybe 5.5 letters per word here. Here we thought maybe 4.2. But the true average number of letters per word was 3.94. Notice right here, this is centered a little less than 4. So, we have to have a good way to collect data. And what was the one way that made sure our data was not biased? We had to collect it with a random sample, right? If it was subjective, if you got to pick, it's going to be biased. If it's convenient, like we talked about earlier, it's going to be biased, right? Got to have a random sample in there. If there's no randomization, it's a problem. So don't forget the big idea, the whole thing, and this is on that sheet that I gave y'all from Skew the Script. So I would use Skew the Script as a foundational piece, but I would transfer my notes over to those Frere models because you can look through 3 pages of Skew the Script plus everything else we look at eventually, or you could put your notes onto 4 total pages with your Frere models, right? And so it's going to help you focus your attention. So the whole goal though is to take a sample, a subset of individuals, and make an inference about the population. And so we've even done a recap of categorical, quantitative, statistical, non-statistical. We have not done a recap of like sample population, but we'll get to that, and characteristic of interest. But I'll build that in. What we're about to focus heavily on is different types of bias. I think that was what you were asking about, Jeremiah, right? The idea of bias. We're going to heavily talk about bias today. One thing I will make a note of is this. The simplest way to understand bias is that when it's biased, we're missing the mark. The true average letters per word was 3.94. Did we get anywhere close to this overall in this sample? So that was a biased sample, right? Now, I will point out, were there some points that were pretty darn close?
Yeah.
So it's not that we always miss the mark, it's that we overall or consistently miss the mark. Here, didn't we have a whole lot at 4 and a little below 4? So did we always miss the mark here? No. We just missed the mark overall, and so that created problems. But here, and even here, did I always hit the mark of 3.94?
No.
Sometimes we missed it. But if I look overall, it is hitting the mark in general. Okay? And so bias in general is that idea, are we overall hitting the mark or not? And remember, this subjective sample was an example of undercoverage, because what words did y'all not pick very often? The small words. Your eyes are drawn to big words, right? So your small words were undercovered. There's undercoverage bias because we did not pick those small words. Make sense? Okay, so there's a little recap there. Yesterday, we started talking about the Southwest Tennessee Community College student outcomes. It's going to help us understand this type of bias a little bit as well. And so remember, they made the claim that 98.5%, did we get to this part yesterday? Yes, okay. 98.5% of their graduates are getting jobs, are going on to a four-year institution, something like that, which that sounds great, right? I want to go to that school, but what was the problem? A lot of people didn't graduate, right? Only 27% even graduated. So we're not accounting for any of these. That's under coverage. We didn't even remotely look at 73% of the actual data. So we're undercovering the population that was everybody who attends that college. Okay? Just a quick recap, right? So it's BS. It's bad statistics. We don't want BS in our lives. We don't want bad statistics in our lives. We want good data. All right, so yesterday, we didn't actually do, that's right, we got to here. We didn't do this right section, did we? The mild section, we just did this medium. Does that sound right? I think we did too. I don't think we got a chance to review it, so let's go over this right here. So, a manager of a company, which you have this on your FAIR model, so please, I'll give you a second to get that FAIR model out. Say again? I don't. I'll print it in a second. While I have them working on the right section, I'll print it out. Gotcha. Well, no, we don't want to pull it up. Okay. So notice this is the population sample and characteristic of interest one. So a manager of a company wanted to know what proportion of employees' sick days occurred on Fridays. The manager randomly selects 500 sick days and determines how many of them occurred on Fridays. So what did the researcher want to know in this case?
The proportion of employees sick days occur on Friday.
Right? Literally it says, this is what they determined, right? So, how many, oh, and also I guess they worded up here as well. That's what they wanted to know. That's what they really should focus on, what we wanted to know. So proportion of sick days on Fridays. Why, by the way, why do you think a manager might want to know this?
Because those sick days are default.
Yeah, those sick days may be false. They claim that they're sick, but what are they doing? They're playing hooky on work, right? If you have more sick days on a Friday, that's probably people trying to take a 3-day weekend. That's important for a manager to know, right? So what proportion are happening on Fridays? So that's what the researchers want to know. By the way, what's that called, that thing the researchers want to know? That is the whole concept of a characteristic of interest, what the researcher wants to know, right? So make sure you connect this idea of characteristic of interest with what the researcher wants to know. Okay, and we're going to get more practice with this a little bit later, so I'm going to move through this a little quickly. But one thing I want to give a hint on, actually, I'll wait a second. In this problem, what's the collection of all individuals in the study?
All employee sick days.
Okay, and I really like the way that you included the small detail at the end, because I thought you were about to say all employees. But are we actually collecting data from the employees?
No,
What are we actually getting data from?
they're sick.
Just their sick days, right? And notice what's a key word that Jeremiah included here? All, right? When we are talking about a collection, we're talking about all. And a lot of times when we say the word individuals, a lot of people think, hey, it has to be people. It doesn't have to be people. It has to be what we're collecting data from and what we want to know about, right? So what was the small group of data that the small group of data came from to make a prediction?
500 sick days.
The 500 sick days. I want y'all to notice something, because I talked about this yesterday in the first block, because we got a chance to finish this. but they forgot it when we got to today's lesson. Please notice the context for these two. The context is what? It is sick days, but in general, the context, is it similar or is it different? And not just similar, it's the same, isn't it? Like if I want to make a prediction about this, doesn't the sample have to have the same exact context? That's a huge hint. Like personally, I always start with my sample because, oh, we selected 500 sick days. Okay, that's my sample. That's what we're getting our data from. Well then, the population just has to be all the sick days. That 500 becomes all. And so, what is this talking about right here? The collection of all individuals, that's my population. That's who I want to make who or what I want to make a prediction about. The small group is called my sample. And that's the 500. That's where I get my data. So don't forget, sample, subset we get the data from. Population, the big group we're making an inference about. Right? So sample, subset the data comes from. Population, the big group we're making an inference about. We will pick back up from there after lunch because I just realized what time it was. Do this really quickly for me. On the M5-73, just make a star next to E, G, H, and I because we haven't covered those yet, so you don't need to do anything with E, G, H, and I. So, sorry, this that we gave y'all yesterday, right here.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, you weren't here yesterday, so we'll give it to you in a second. Just put a star next to E, G, H, and I, so that we know, thank you, that we're not doing anything with that. I'll come back from lunch. Do you have that sheet? There it is. There you go. Just put a star next to E, G, H, and I. By the way, I just ordered probably 12 more notebooks. I want you to take one just for my math class so you can keep it organized. Sound good? So just so we're not mixing and matching courses. But head on to lunch. E, G, H, and I. We haven't covered those terms yet. Yeah, confounding. So just put a star next to it because we're going to come back to it. Just put a star because we're going to come back to it.
Yeah, I heard that's what you
Oh yeah, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
So you don't have to edit it out.
Yeah. Up so that we can get into the other things I want to practice with. So I do want to remind you or point out, I wanted you to do the right portion of this assignment, right? So remember we said take out E, G, H, and I. We're not doing those vocabulary terms yet. I want you to look at the definitions there, match the vocabulary that's left with the correct definitions. So there will be 4 definitions we don't use. We'll come back to those, okay? So look at that right portion, work with each other. Let's actually go ahead and put our responses on vertical surfaces. So let's do this. Jeremiah, why don't you work with these guys on that vertical surface, putting our answers up, and then Mariah, why don't you work with, we just went to boys versus girls. Oh well, it's fine. Mariah, why don't you work up here on this vertical surface to do that right portion. So just write number 1 and then the letter that goes with it, okay? So it's going to help us think about that critical vocabulary to be better prepared. And if you finish that right first portion early, move on to the spicy. It helps if we get onto the vertical surface. So just be aware we're not using E, G, H, or I yet. That's all experiments, and we're not doing experiments yet. That's the next lesson. You looking for the sheet? We will check your understanding, something, right? So keep in mind, you do check your understandings that we haven't done yet at home, and check your understanding. All right. I'm gonna give you a second to write down what notes you need to, but what we are about to pick up on is bias, right? That's what Jeremiah was asking about. We're gonna develop our understanding of bias better, different types of bias, etc. So, you still marking those down, Jeremiah? Are you good? Okay. So, I want you to remember, like, there's this definition on the Skew the Script lesson that you always want to go back to. At the end of the day, bias means there's a study flaw that leads to unrepresentative and or inaccurate estimates. Heck, there's even a definition or a very similar definition on that assignment you just did for bias sample. Right on here, they said biased sample was a sample that is not representative of the population. Not the exact same words, but the same exact ideas, right? So, a study flaw that leads to unrepresentative or inaccurate estimates. So the sample does not represent the population, right? And then the most common, or the type of bias we've covered so far, is undercoverage. Meaning, part of the population has a lower chance of being included in a sample. You did not pick those small words when we did This is America, right? The small words were undercovered or underrepresented. So we should already have that in our Skew the Script notes, right? Okay. So here's a second type of bias that I want us to be aware of. It's called non-response bias. Any guesses what non-response bias might mean? Specifically, it's in surveys, because you reach out to people, and I will say this, Tracy, this is from the Skew the Script notes, not off of that sheet. So it's what you can see right here in Caleb's hands. Okay, it's a sheet that I passed out. I gave that to y'all 2 days ago, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So non-response bias. Non-response. Any guesses what we mean by non-response? Write that word down.
Non-responsive.
Oh, that makes sense, right? Not responding. You know what non-response bias is? It's when people selected do not don't respond, right? Like non-response. Non-response bias is when people don't respond. So let's see how this can play out right here. Because you can't really have non-response bias when it comes to picking words from a song. But in a recent report, so this came from 2017 to 2019, so about 5 to 7 years ago. Actually, the data came from 5 to 7 years ago. I think the report came out in after 2020. But Rogers State University found that about 75% of graduates were pursuing another degree or found full-time employment by their final semester. Notice, by the last semester, not even after they graduated, but by their last semester they were in school, they were going to start another degree, or they had found full-time employment. And that's awesome. Finding a job like that before you even finish out school, that'd be fantastic. Well, we want to make sure we don't have BS, right? We want to make sure we don't have bad statistics. So let's investigate this claim a little further. So how did the university collect this data? Surveys, right? So when we say a survey is a type of observational study where you send questions out to people. That's what a survey is. Okay, you send questions out. That's on the assignment that y'all just did, so I'll leave that alone for now. But here's what I want you to know. They send those surveys out to the students at the school in their last semester, and how many or what % of people responded? Say it again. 20% responded, right? So that means we're missing data from how many people that were selected for the survey. 80%, right? Like, we got 20%, we're missing 80%. So that should be a huge red flag. The question is, why in the world are we missing 80%?
Non-responsive.
There's non-responding, but why are they not responding?
Because they didn't graduate.
Because why?
They didn't graduate.
Well, remember, so they're in their final semester, right? So they wouldn't have graduated yet anyways. But the question is, hey, you're in your final semester. Are you going to pursue another degree, or have you already found a job? Right?
They didn't either.
Say again?
They didn't either.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you were someone who was going to go on to another degree, or you already had a job lined up, are you more likely or less likely to respond? If you already have those things?
More.
I was saying, I'd be bragging about it for sure. I'd be like, yeah, I got a job lined up. What if you don't have a job lined up? Are you going to respond as
No.
highly? No, right? That's the idea of non-response. Why did 80% not respond? Oh, because they didn't have a job lined up. They didn't want to admit that. They were ashamed. They were whatever. Now, it doesn't guarantee that's why people didn't respond. What's another reason that people didn't respond? Probably just didn't feel like it, right? Like, had nothing to do with whether they had a job or not. They just didn't feel like responding. What's another reason people may not have responded? Could it just be that they forgot? Could you forget to respond to an email, a survey? Guarantee you this, I don't respond very often to surveys I get from the University of Alabama. I just forget, right? So the non-response is not a bad thing unless it's at a really high rate. Why did 80% not respond? We expect like 10% not to respond or something like that. But why did the other 80% not respond? That's what's worrying. And when you have non-response, you have bad statistics because we don't have enough data on everybody. That's important to recognize. Non-response bias gives bad data, okay? So how could bias in the sampling method have affected the estimate? Well, here's what non-response is. First off, when individuals chosen for a sample don't respond. This leads to bias if those who do not respond differ from those who did. And so we have to ask ourselves, is there a reason why we didn't have 80%, right? So notice most of that's already there on that sheet, the second page, but you do want to add in and make sure that it's important to recognize that that non-response can lead to bias if those who did not respond differ from those who did. And so we have to critically think about it. It's actually going to come back up a little bit when we talk about Abraham Vaughn's airplane problem and where to put the armor. Something similar is playing in there, even though it's not non-response. It's closer to undercoverage, but it's a similar idea. Why did those who didn't respond, why didn't they respond? So notice always thinking about the population. Now the whole population that we're wanting to know about is the what? All the graduates, right? But our sample is only those who what? Responded, right? We selected them, we asked them to respond, but only some of them responded, right? 20%. And so the grads without jobs probably respond less often. That's exactly what we realized. Oh man, they probably didn't have something lined up, so they didn't want to admit that. I think there might be space for that. Usually wherever there's blue, there's space for that to be written. If not, you don't have to, but it's important to understand the vocabulary and be able to recognize it, and we'll practice with it soon, okay? So it's important to understand that non-response is when people don't respond, and there's a reason why they don't respond, okay? Jeremiah, do you need the first page? Somewhere. I was saying it's numbered on those pages if you look. Let me know if you need it. Okay. You need me to continue waiting? You got this?
I got it.
Okay, got it. Mariah, you getting that information down? Okay. So again, the big idea is again just focusing on non-response, and so just giving this example, hey, grads without jobs probably respond less often. That's when they don't respond. Okay. What's up?
The way this is worded with the blank is weird. Under non-response, it says leads to bias if these individuals blank from.
Differ from.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
what I was trying to compare it to that.
Yeah, I got you. Differ from the
I was like,
respondents.
wait, where do I put left option?
Okay. So here's the last type of bias that we're going to focus on. There are a couple other types, but the last big one I want to focus on is something called voluntary response bias. Okay. If I were to do this box balling study, right? If I were to ask, hey, how many people, or not how many people, what's a typical number of times that people could hit this ball without messing up? And I just ask people to volunteer. I don't randomly sample. If I just ask them to volunteer, how would that group of people who volunteer be different from the rest of the population? Who's going to volunteer to do this so that we could figure out the true number of times people at Hillcrest can hit this without messing up? You're gonna volunteer? Or you have an idea? Okay, you would volunteer. But my question is like, just thinking about people at Hillcrest High School, who would volunteer in general for this?
Like, athletes.
Would athletes be more likely to respond and volunteer? So would athletes, do you think athletes in general would do better with this or worse than this? Or about the same as the normal population?
Depends on the sport.
Depends on the sport, but overall, what do we think?
Better.
Say again?
Better.
Why would maybe athletes do better?
They practice more.
So they practice more, right? They've got better control of their fine motor skills. Maybe they have better hand-eye coordination, right? So if I'm doing this study and I just let people volunteer, is that going to give me good data for the rest of Hillcrest High School? No, right? If you let people volunteer, typically they're people who feel really good about something or they have very strong opinions. And so when you let people volunteer, it usually leads to bad statistics. It leads to BS. And so make sure that you are always thinking about that. We don't want volunteers, right? Another thing is people who are competitive might volunteer. People who are competitive might go practice or might be better at it in general because, again, they just want to do the best. If you don't care, you're not really going to care about it. You're just going to like, eh. I'm naturally competitive. I screwed up earlier, which kind of still irritates me, and I want to do better. But I'm just not because I got to teach or whatever, right? But like, if you're competitive, you're going to crank the ball out, and you're going to be like, oh, I got this. So, what do we not want?
Bad.
We don't want bad statistics. What can lead to bad statistics?
Voluntary.
Voluntary response bias, or literally just that last word of bias. And what types of bias are there? Well, there's voluntary response bias, non-response bias, undercoverage bias. And also, if you use convenience sampling, that's going to be biased. If you use subjective sampling, that's going to be biased, right? So it's important to recognize that these types of bias exist. If you got biased data, you got bad data. Okay? So here's a good example as well. You want to study heart rate during exercise, you recruit volunteers to run a mile and then measure their pulse, right? The ones who like to run are the ones who volunteer, so they're healthier on average than the population. That's biased data, it's biased samples. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here on simple random sample because we're not going to focus on how to collect a simple random sample. I just need us to recognize for our sample to not be biased, for our sample to represent the population, what type of sampling do we have to do?
Right.
You gotta have random sampling for your sample to be representative of the population. Which brings us to, and here's why, I will point this out, I should have said this earlier. A random sampling means that every individual has what chance of being selected? An equal chance, right? When you subjectively chose, you chose bigger work, not everyone had an equal chance of being selected. But when you use a random number generator, that number generator didn't care what was bigger or what was longer. Every word had an equal chance of being selected. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So you gotta have what to reduce that bias?
Random.
Randomness, okay? So, to bring that back, I'm gonna just jump to here. So, here's this bullet hole problem with the planes. Was that a random sample?
No.
No, so it's probably biased in some way, isn't it? Now, based on this data, we said we're probably putting that extra armor where?
The main branch.
In the what?
The main body.
The main body, maybe the wing, something like that, right? We gotta protect that plane. It's getting shot up in the main body. But here's the thing, and this is what Abraham Wald realized, and what we have to realize, it's important to pay attention to the bias. Because when I look right here, these are the planes that made it back, right? So planes made it back when they got shot in the body. Planes made it back when they were shot in the engine. Planes made it back when they were shot in the tail. Planes made it back when they were shot in the, which ones have I not said yet? Engines maybe? Something like that. Those are the planes that made it back. Which ones didn't make it back? The one shot in the what? Oh, we got an engine one right here.
The wing.
No.
I would say, none of these got shot in the nose, did they? Oh, why is that? Well, because all the ones that got shot in the nose got shot down. It's important to understand bad statistics, and it's also important to understand how bias can affect things. Because if we understand the bias here, well then we can account for this, right? And so it's important to recognize, because I'll go and tell you, when I first saw this little lesson and this piece of it, I was like, oh, I'm going to go with the main body too. And then the guy leading it, who actually developed Skew the Script, he was like, and yeah, you want to put it in the nose. And I'm like, what? And he was like, yeah, because if you look at it, these are only the ones that made it back. Anything that got shot in the nose apparently got shot down. It's still out in the battlefield, right? We got to make sure we're putting that extra armor in the nose. It's important to understand good statistics and good data. Make sense? Okay. So, here's what we're going to do. We got 10 minutes left. We're going to do as much of this as we can. I do want to give you all some time to work. And so, really quickly, just because I'm going to ask you to do this at home, turn to page 5 in the notes, the Skew the Script notes. It should.
You just had it out.
So I want to keep things organized, Caleb.
I thought it. It's
You just had one that's just one side.
There it is. There's page 3, 4, there's page 5. I just want to point out, so questions 5 through 9 is actually just matching, okay? Please notice, we did not cover all those types of bias, did we? Which types of bias did we not cover?
I thought you just had it.
Self-reporting and question wording, right? So don't worry about D&D. That means that you are going to have 2 of 5 through 9 that you don't actually answer, okay? It does say justify your choice, so it's going to give you some time to think about this, but there's going to be 2 of 5 through 9 that you're not going to answer. So just be aware you're not worried about D&D. You can probably find it. It would be helpful if you found it, but think about A, B, and C there. Next, I do want you to work on number 1 to start. One more. Oh, also, do not do number 4, because we're not doing that, and do not do 3B. So cross out number 4, cross out 3B. We're not going to do those. So all you got to do is 1 and 2, and then 5 through 9, at least the ones that we're doing, right? So it's not that much. Do you have these sheets? Okay, I'll print some out for you, and then we need one more, right? Okay, so I just want to point this out. I do want you all working together for the next, let's say, 5 minutes, then we'll pack up. Please notice in number 1, are you answering the question in A? Like, there's no real question there. What are you supposed to be doing in 1A?
Bag or anything?
Identify the population and the sample. Okay, make sure you read directions. People in first walk very bonkers. They're like, I don't know what to do. I'm like, dog, did you read the instructions? No. Okay, let's get on vertical surfaces. 5 minutes, identify the population, identify the sample,
It
and
came
let's get to
with,
it.
it's okay.
Just kidding, we need,
The rest of it,
yeah, Charlie's the
first page.
Yeah.
No, you're never allowed to use that thing for the rest of your life. You can't hold it for 7 minutes.
Never be prepared, who knows?
The reflection you fill out today.
oh,
Never
yeah,
got
he
me
has
a
to go.
paper.
You know Jeremiah, you don't got no paper.
What's up?
I was gonna reflect the, but you have to turn it in.
Yes. Okay.
Is the proposal? Oh, yes,
Yep,
perfect.
found them. You still need that, right? So we don't think the population and the sample are in 1A.
1-8. Huh? Oh, hold on, this is the wrong page.
Yes.
Me.
Me needed it, yeah.
Yeah, you did it. And So this is the page you're missing, but I'm gonna give you both of these. This is where you're starting.
I don't know, this one too, right?
You don't have it here? You have it.
I don't got them.
Yes, you do.
I just got,
I saw you grab it.
I just got 3, I just got 3, 5, and 2. Oh. I didn't know what you
I told you.
Oh, 1, 8, alright, then you
Hello?
Which one is he sending down? Is it the population?
She's not in here yet, but I can send her down when she gets in here for 4 o'clock.
You did it.
Mhm.
20 respond to the poll.
Go ahead, right.
So maybe you were thinking the poll, right? So why were you thinking it was the poll though? So what is sample? The individual's natural study. So, because I wanted to point out, I like this conversation. Remember the
What is
poll
number,
is
what
how
did you just write?
getting
What
data
is
from the
that?
sample, but it's not the sample.
What is it though?
Remember we talked about this?
So what are you
earlier.
missing?
The units
What word are you
have
missing?
to match.
All.
The
All
population
students.
is the sample.
Every time you think of
That's
population,
subset.
think of all.
But notice it's still the
Everyone
students. And you can get more specific, and you
Alright,
can
then
even
what's the
say
second?
all the
part
students
that I asked
in the teacher's class, right? The 20 students who responded to the poll. But that is good. Just make sure we justify it, right? Practice justifying it. Oh, that population is everything we want to make a
Oh,
difference
whoa,
about.
whoa,
The
whoa.
sample is the subset we get our data from. Okay. So continue with B.
Oh, you need to identify the population and the sample. So what's the sample for part A? Why is it the 20 students? Yeah. Alright, now we're doing the grades. In this case, you can do either, since it gives you a value, right? Because you just said like 18 or all. You could do either, or you could do both.
I would even say all.
You could
18
do all,
grades.
yeah, all 18 grapes.
Okay, really quickly, because we only have 2.5 minutes, I just want to wrap this up and point this out. So, again, remember we talked about this earlier today. I see claims for all of y'all's, but what am I not seeing on the board with your claim?
Evidence.
Oh, the evidence, right? Go back to the definitions. Y'all all have the right ideas, but tell me why you're thinking this. Why is it all the students in his class? I'm assuming that's for population. Why is that my population? Yes, that's part of it, but also remember, what's the whole point? We want to make in.
Only the students in his class.
It's only the students in his class, but it's who we're trying to make in. Starts with an I. Inference about, right? Like, what do we want to know about? We want to know, or who do we want to know about? The students in this class. That's our inference. That's the big group. That's everybody. So why is this my sample, the 20 students? So they're responding. Remember, I always go back to that definition. Defining a sample is that the sample is another S word. It's a subset, a smaller group. You can say either one of those, right? It's a subset of the population. And what do we get from the sample? We get our
Just one word, just subset.
It's who we get our what from? Starts with a D. Data from, right? Remember, sample, it's the subset we get our data from. The subset of the population we get our data from. Go back to the definition. All the students in this class, that's the population because that's everybody, all right? The bell is going to catch us in under a minute. So please remember, I do record, so I got that information up here, but make sure you get your answers. So these are good answers, but also justify with the definition.
Because you were smart.
Put
You
the
know what I'm talking about.
evidence.
And you just zone out most of the time.
Chill out,
If you
bro.
need to,
No more
take a
zoning
quick
out.
picture of this
No
so
zoning
that
out.
you can put this in your notes.
You will pass this test if you participate.
You were
Yes,
just all
that
up in the
was right.
camera.
I mean, soon.
You were just all up in the
I
camera.
mean, you're in
told
school,
y'all
you're
the
gonna
man
eventually
kept.
have a test. But
He is
participate
100%
and
correct,
do
you will eventually have a test. So by eventually our assessment, first assessment will probably be on Wednesday.
Thank
That's
you.
what I be like, what?
Just chill, I don't be acting like that.
Is your card on, is this your first?
So those are good examples, just make sure you justify. Go back to the definitions.